to get out of the way and to get started, because we have so much brilliance here on the dais, I want to start by talking about immigration first. Lately, I've been thinking about the process that my parents went through in the 70s and 80s, and actually into the early 90s, to remain in the country. I was just reading a story actually earlier today about John Lennon's own immigration fight in the US. Because he had a little dope in his apartment in London, he had a stain on his record. And because of that, the US government wanted to run him out on the rail. So when the decision came down from the government, the federal government, to rescind DACA, I started thinking about those experiences in immigration courtrooms that I had as a child, watching my parents fight for legal status in the country. And that was kind of remarkable because they were being told by the government that they were layabouts. And anyone who is in or from an immigrant family knows that everyone is here to work, and work to the bone. All of this kind of was drumming up for me with the recent events in Charlottesville, because I happened to be in Cape Town, South Africa, when that jumped off. And one of the things that came to me about immigration was this weird kind of place one is always in when racist stuff drops down, or when weird decisions are made from the government about how to position yourself in relationship to the nation state and wherever else you might come from. So I open up to the panel and ask, how do you negotiate that in terms of your family status or your individual status as immigrant, and your relationship to this particular place and the place where your families come from?
Where do we start?
Somebody go first. What do you go?
Go ahead.
I'm Jamaican. I'm always All right, well, I will go first. I don't have to negotiate it in quite the same way because I am American by birth, although frankly I am just waiting for the current government to roll back birthright citizenship. It feels like it's not totally insane and out of the realm of possibility. And I think it's one of those things where I feel less like an immigrant than my parents do. And so my parents, in a certain sense, don't really understand the 4 children that they fought so hard to raise in this country and in this culture. And certainly when I think about the immigration stories that are unfolding right now so dramatically across this country, my siblings and I, born and bred, very cosseted upper middle class Americans, could never undertake to go to another country and learn a language and a way of life and a new culture and find employment and make a family. It's astonishing to me that people do that.
Rigo, you were going back and forth throughout your childhood
Yes,
in the West.
Yeah, I come from 3 generations of migrant farm workers. So these are grape pickers in California. I was born in California, but at the age of 2, my family moved back to Mexico. My parents were undocumented. And this is in the 1970s, 80s. It was easier to go back and forth. I think it still is in a ways, but as an undocumented alien. So for me, it's like I'm so far removed from that. I'm just trying to negotiate that sense of fear that my family had. My grandmother, whenever we see something in the mail, back in the days before the internet, we would receive, our spam was actually letters in the mail. And we received these envelopes with these stamps with an eagle on it. And my grandmother was always convinced that was the government. They found us out, and there they are, they're gonna kick us out. And I would open these because I was the only one that could read and write. That was another thing that I had to deal with as a child. My parents and my grandparents were illiterate. And it would be an announcement to a furniture sale. Right? But it would cause that kind of anxiety. So for me, it was like understanding the power of language, but also the power of my privilege as an American citizen. that as long as I was around, my family felt a sense of safety in a way, right? So I learned that kind of power very early, and I learned to use it in good ways, and I think it still kind of fuels my passion and my sense of obligation to be open about who I am, who my family was, where they came from, and so forth.
Porochista, you came rather young. Did you also have that same kind of negotiator position, you and your siblings, where you're learning the language probably faster than your parents might, and so you stand between the home, which is like some small version of Iran, and the large-scale culture of America?
Yeah, we, everybody in my family has a completely different status. So none of us really relate to each other. My father is still not an American citizen. I became an American citizen in 2001 with my mother. And my brother was born in the US. And we're 5 years apart, so he's 5 years younger than me. But those 5 years are huge. First of all, it actually separates us from like Gen X and Millennial. But it also, like, he had these incredible privileges as an American that I never had. For most of my life, he knew me as just an Iranian. And so, like, I was trying to shed my accent or ESL and all that, but he was really excited about learning Farsi.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he actually went to college to learn that in an academic setting, whereas I was trying to unlearn that. I was trying to be like an American writer. So it was this funny thing where I was sort of resentful that he didn't have an experience of like some shame or fear. And then I kind of thought of him as like a fake Iranian. You know, I'd make fun of his accents and like, you don't know what this is, you know? And so there's like all these authenticity things. And then right now my dad is driving us crazy that because he could have, it's actually very hard for Iranians to become American citizens. I keep hearing like Americans even in New York saying like, well, why don't you just become a citizen? It's like, it's not actually easy for people from a lot of countries to become citizens. Like on average, I think in Iranian, it's over 10 years to get your citizenship. So ours, even with like sending a special lawyer money, kind of shady in LA, that took 10 years. So, you know, my dad decided not to, and he's been really stubborn about it. He still won't do it. I think part of it is he doesn't want to raise attention to his status, but also it's like, he just wants to, he hates it. You know, there's a part of him that like, really hates America more than ever now because of this. It's pretty awkward being one of the 6 countries on this Muslim ban list. It's something that is in my head a lot, and I'm sure it is for him too. But what's been weird in our conversations lately is that he's almost at times sounding like he's not pro-Trump, but like a little bit like he did it, like when I grew up, he was always telling me like, remember that Iranians are not white, you're brown, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. And then he recently said something like, well, you know, there's only one color. And I was like, what? And he was like, no, well, maybe Americans like are doing the right thing for them. And I was like, there's some weird PTSD thing. So there's constantly like negotiating within our household, like nobody sees eye to eye really.
Nicole, you came as, let's say, a late adolescent.
Yes.
You must have had plenty of access, though, to American culture, music, TV, whatever. What was that adjustment like coming as a student?
Yeah, so my father came here first. He was undocumented. For the most part, he was, you know, that New York City cab driver. And most of the money that he made was sending money back to us at home. I went to this school, St. Andrew High School for Girls, which Garnette knows pretty well. And, you know, in order for us to afford that school, it was his money being sent back home. And so when it was time for me to go to college, you know, having that depression break in lower sixth form, that's what we call them. It's kind of similar to community colleges here, where, you know, I said to my mother, I want to come to America to go to college, because I was actually told by someone at school who was doing essay writing that, you know, you won't go to college, you can't get into the colleges that you want because your parents did not go to college. And I believed that. And so, of course, when that crash happened, you know, this severe depression that I had, my mother picked up the phone and called my father saying, can you take her? Can you take her to America? She needs to live with you. So I ended up in a very uncomfortable situation where I was living with my father and my stepmother, who was like stunned, like resentful of the fact that here's this other family from Jamaica moving in to this country. And there was also the anxiety of of getting a green card. Because of course, because my father had married an American woman, he was able to get his green card and then later apply for citizenship. And so that was how he was able to file for me to get my green card. And then back to the language, I realized when I got my green card, on this, well, many Americans may not know that on the card itself, it says alien. And that was actually, you know, I was always into words growing up in Jamaica. I loved reading, I loved writing, and seeing that word alien immediately put me in a box. And of course, my father sat me down and told me, well, you know, you're not a real American. You know, you're gonna stay here, but at the same time, know your place, be silent, be quiet, you know, step aside. You know, I was relearning. So I was actually unlearning what it is like to be a woman existing in a black society. You know, the way we as St. Andrew High School girls were taught, you walk straight, you sit a certain way, you dress a certain way, you speak a certain way. To come to America where I'm cowering, because with the green card, you're still not, well, I mean, you're legit, but at the same time, if weed is found in your bag, and God forbid, you know, the police checks you at the subway station, you're good, you're gone. So, you know, I found myself walking on this thin line, a thin thread. And then, of course, when I applied to Cornell, the school I wanted to really go to, you know, I transferred from Nassau Community College in Garden City, Long Island. Because, of course, I didn't come directly as a, you know, many Jamaicans apply via a program to attend four-year colleges. But because I grew up working class Jamaican, I actually came here through my father going to community college where he lives, and then applying to the four-year college I wanted, which is Cornell. And existing in Ithaca was another culture shock for me. For obvious reasons, the weather. I could not deal with snow. And of course, when I was reading the brochures, they showed us the fall pictures where everybody was smiling. They had on their nice warm colors like what I'm wearing. But no one was, you know, I didn't know that the snow was snow. So when I got there, it was gray all the time. And I had this, you know, luckily I was surrounded by other women at Cornell. In fact, they were mostly, they were immigrant women, and also they were African-American women. I lived in this great household of these women. And, you know, they would talk about their stories all the time, and their families would visit and cook us meals, like real meals that I was used to back home. And so it kind of felt like home. So that kind of was my saving grace at Cornell. And then, of course, I got the guts to move to Ann Arbor, Michigan for grad school. Another, in the heart of America this time. And, you know, the same thing, the same culture shock was there. But at the same time, there was this resilience as an immigrant that I'm here to work, I'm here to achieve. I gotta just, you know, do what I want to do, and you know, in the long run it paid off, but at the same time there were struggles, and so that's why we're here now to talk about that. But
Garnette, you didn't think about snow. You thought about the northern capital of the Caribbean by going to New Orleans to study. But one of the things that comes out from your really brilliant essay, I'm going to think of its title in the collection, Black and Blue, right? Is that the adjustment process that Nicole was just mentioning, coming from Jamaica to the US, became another kind of, if you will, degree granting program, because you wanted to move about the city, you wanted to learn New Orleans, you wanted to take a hold of that city, but you learned very quickly that you couldn't move about in the same fashion. And that process of learning how to be in a black body in a racist country, or at least a space where race matters, was striking. Talk about that part of the process. You're here legit, but suddenly you feel illegitimate.
About 2 years after I graduated, I went to a concert, the band Steel Pulse, the reggae band, terrific band Steel Pulse, with one of my professors. And it's the House of Blues, and it's being New Orleans. It is a very different relationship to the law than most of the rest of the United States. So everybody was smoking weed, not me. And so my professor was smoking weed, and I mean, really smoking weed, like from beginning to end. And we finished, and he had driven, and we went to the parking lot, which was in the same place, a movie theater across the street. And we got in the elevator, and there were like 5 cops in the elevator. and the elevator door closes. And we're going up, and he's like, "What floor are we on?" Now, I knew the floor. And, I was supposed to remember the floor because he would forget because he was high. And he goes, "Garnette, what floor are we on?" "Garnette, I'm talking to you. What floor are we on?" Wouldn't say anything. The elevator went up, all the way up. The cops got out, the door closed, and said, "Oh, we're in floor 5. And he goes, "What the hell?" And it's like, "You have an American accent. I'm in an elevator with 5 cops. I have the Jamaican accent. You're stink of weed. There is no way they're going to not think that I'm the one smoking weed." And of course, they were already having that suspicious look. And of course, that came from having spent 4 years in college with at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, people would always knock on the door and say, "You're the Jamaican guy?" It's like, "Yeah." "You have any weed?" "No, I don't have any weed." All of which is to say that I'd come to a country in which I'd recognize that, there's this thing with being someone who's exposed so much to American culture. A lot of immigrants deal with that by the time you hit the US, you figure, "Oh, I know the US. I've grown up with their songs, with their movies, learned their history, seen them gallivanting on, my, beaches and under the waterfalls and the mountains. I know them, and, they've been here quite a bit. So of course they know me. Only to come and recognize that they know a caricature of you. And so it's first having that shock of non-recognition of, it's almost like that relative you've always known, and come to recognize that the relative had never seen you really. And what they have seen is some truncated, thwarted version of what you really are. So of course the guy who's getting knocked on his door for 4 years to sell weed, or the guy who refuses to say, "We're in floor 5 because the elevator stink of weed and there are 5 cops and I'm not opening my mouth for that." And what it does is, too often the dissonances become an even deeper shock to you. To walk in a place and to feel too much at ease, to feel too comfortable, and then to be jolted out of that comfort, often in violent or harsh, brutal ways. So of course I came and was walking around New Orleans. I felt, oh, I'd know New Orleans. They call it the northernmost city of the Caribbean. I mean, you live in New Orleans long enough, you figure that people call it the northernmost city of the Caribbean because they figured, there are, all these multicolored houses and it's hot. So that's a connection. It's not really the cultural, connection. Or also things take a little bit longer to happen there than anywhere else. So, the entire city can feel like one long DMV experience. And so they figure, oh, so that's why it's Caribbean. That meant. And so you heard all these things, and then only to begin walking. And of course, never really having to think of myself as a body before I came to the US. That it could be a mind walking, I could walk and I'd be in my head and in all these reveries in your mind. And you read all these writings about people walking in cities in America, and it always feels like, oh, their minds, people thinking, people getting lost. And then you come here and you just get jolted to recognizing, oh, I am a body, that I have the luxury of being a mind. From walking to even, since we're at NBCC event, to even, writing, that time and again people said, oh, we have a book for you to review. I'm like, oh, great. Oh, it's the next black book, it's the next black topic. And you recognize that even that you're actually a body, they can't get past the body. They can't get past the fact that you're embodied in a black body. That, oh, of course, no, you can't write about Louis Gluck. No, you have to write about the Caribbean, the black Caribbean, because that's what you are. And so walking, was this reminder time and time again that, I'm a body, I'm embodied. And in a way that, was uncomfortable, in a way that was harsh, in a way that was dehumanizing, but even beyond that, a way that was dangerous. And so that's, for me, and to walk around, this city that was the northernmost Caribbean, it's supposed to be this marvelous city, and then to be reminded that, oh, you're a foreigner, but you're a foreigner in a body that is under threat because we assume that you're a threat.
That's making me think of something, Rumaan, that you wrote about in, I can't think of the name of the novel, Setal's novel. There's a moment where you start thinking about, isn't it a little bit on the nose, I think is your phrase, for you to be taking on these books by other brown writers.
Well, nothing is better than getting a freelance assignment you didn't ask for, right? So when an editor emails you and out of the blue and says, oh, we have a book for you to review, you're like, oh, great, I'll $100. And then he sent me the book, and I was like, oh, it's a gay brown guy? Like, you couldn't even send me a book by like a lesbian or like stretch just a bit. So I do understand what you.
How do you, is that a gift and a curse though? That kind of assignment?
It seems silly to wish it were anything else. You know, I mean, it is what it is. Even the New York Review of Books, when they write about India, it's Pankaj Mishra. You know, it's like this is top to bottom, and it's such a privilege to be in this business that it's hard to complain about something like that. Mm-hmm. And you know, but here I am complaining about it. So.
Porochista, she wrote this beautiful essay about pretty much getting the Iranian beat for decades. That every time someone sent something to her, it's, oh, you're Iranian, right? You're Iranian. And the way she took that curse and in terrific ways made it a blessing. I mean, it's well worth reading. Remember the title of the essay? It was in Catapult.
It was in Catapult. It was called How to Write Iranian America, or The Last Essay. Because I actually thought of it as the last essay I would ever write, because I was actually working on it while I was getting all these assignments, which were primarily from the New York Times 10 years ago when my first novel came out. It was supposed to be this big honor that I was being asked to write Iranian American essays that were really about my own life and about my family's life. And the way the editors of the New York Times saw it was that, like, our audience doesn't know about Iranian America. Can you please, like, introduce them to it? And at first I was like, oh, okay. And then it was like a nightmare, and that was all I was known for. And then there were all these horrible pigeonhole traps. At the same time, like Rumaan's saying, like, it's also like kind of hard to complain about it because you're actually asked to represent something that you care about. It's like this big dilemma constantly I hear about in the literary world, where we're like, this idea of these like diverse panels like this, like, should we do them, right? I mean, on the one hand, if we don't do them, then there's just white people, like there's always been, which is not the answer. But on the other hand, like, shouldn't we be like talking about other things? There's always this problem where you're like, if I don't do it, then who? And this goes back to like an issue of like, American white supremacy and all that, and that you're constantly up against that. So yeah, that essay for me was a way to stay sane.
That makes me think of an interview you did. I can't remember where it was, but I watched it, and you were talking about having moved to the city relatively recent or soon, either right before 9/11. You had just moved to the city, and you actually went through what we'll call a passing phase, where you were telling people that you were not Iranian American.
Yeah.
You were Italian.
Yeah. For some
I
reason,
laughed out loud at that, by the way. I mean,
Yeah,
I was
you're
like,
for some reason, I always have racist cab drivers. To this day, I have had more racist cab drivers than like anyone, and they're just very comfortable to be racist in front of me. And very often it'll be like maybe just racist against others, like anti-black stuff, and I'll be like, no, okay. And then, but often it's anti-Middle Eastern stuff, and then I would notice like, oh, I pass, and I've never really known, like, wherever I've lived, it's like people in that neighborhood, whatever the minority group is, they would think that I was one of them. In New York, like, I could be seen as Puerto Rican, I could be seen as Greek, like, in Harlem, there's people who think, like, they have their own ideas always. So there was this, I for the first time in my life, right after 9/11, I was so scared. I was scared of America looking like it does now, which it didn't quite look like then. And the aftermath of New York, right the next day wasn't like this. And so I found myself like a few times, they were like, you're Italian, right? You're Greek, or you're Jewish would be another thing. I'd be like, yeah. Yeah. And I just was like, that's fine. Like, I don't need to deal with that, because I was terrified. I was terrified of what life looks like now. Exactly. I was scared of a time where we would have like Nazis and,
what's it? Oh,
Go ahead.
yeah. I find it ironic, especially recently. Initially when I introduced myself, coming to America was to me freedom. With my father having me here, but at the same time, what happens is that I never knew, and Garnette touched on this a little bit too, that I never saw race really until I got to this country. And that's one thing I am grappling with, even, as we speak, in terms of race, the race dynamic in America. But at the same time, being here, I'm also technically able to live the life I want to live in terms of, marrying a woman and, writing, like doing what I really want to do here in this country. And one of the pieces that I wrote this past weekend in the New York Times was holding hands on Fulton Street in Brooklyn, New York, where I live. And being called to by Jamaican men, seeing me, identifying me, seeing my dreadlocks, and saying, no Rasta woman does that. So it was really ironic to see, the country that I fled, or not fled, that's like such a strong word, the country I left, in order to find personal freedom. There are individuals, working class individuals there who also come here to find freedom as well. But in them finding freedom, still hold on strongly to the cultural values that certain people dictate, or that religion really dictates on our island. And it has been really interesting grappling with that. And even as I'm speaking right now, I'm like even thinking about that more and more each day. But I said that all this to say that sometimes, as an immigrant, having to explain ourselves, like for a long time I had to explain, like I had a thicker accent, a thicker Jamaican accent, for example. And, I did not get asked for weed, but the initial things that usually happened was like I had like a toddler look at me and say, oh, you sound like my nanny. Or little jabs, little things that would say to my, I found writing as my personal freedom. And most of the things that I write about, which are mostly, in Here Comes the Sun, it was Jamaican working class women. I wanted to document, I actually wanted to show the world that we're more than Bob Marley, we're more than weed smoking, we're more than individuals who you probably see lounging on a beach in this Jamaican mecca that the upper class sell to the world in the tourism industry. I wanted to write those people for the purposes that I'm living in this country, and yes, my readers, I would love my readers to be Jamaicans themselves, but let's say they happen to be Americans as well. I wanted to see the complexity of Jamaicans. I wanted, especially Jamaican women, we have no voices, we're often silenced, and a lot of us come here to this country to actually get, somehow obtain our voices. And so, for me as a writer, I felt like that personal responsibility to write my people on the page the way I want them to be seen, right? With that complexity. So that little 3-year-old toddler probably would encounter a Jamaican in college and say, not that she or he sounds like his or her nanny, but wow, I know you. And so that's something too that I grapple with as a Jamaican/American citizen, how to straddle both of my homes, my world, because I do feel at home here in America, and I do feel at home in Jamaica. And one more point too, like I was published in the Jamaica Observer this past Sunday, the week after I was published in the New York Times, and that's something that's huge, because I'm this girl who felt like I was silenced, felt to respect shame more, and for me to be embraced by both homes was a very humbling experience.
The labor of explanation, though, is really interesting. I'll come to Rumaan and Rigo about this, because Rigo, you have this really brilliant essay that was in the LA Times back in March about people of color moving into professional ranks, but still being misread. And it strikes me that when you are Mexican and moving back and forth, there's one kind of thing you're doing in the family. When you're Bangladeshi, moving back and forth between the home and outside culture, or growing up in a Congolese home and stepping outside, you're continually explaining both at home and outside. And then when you make the decision to become a writer, you keep coming back to this moment where you're explaining that experience of explaining. Isn't that a little heavy? Isn't that a little too much?
Yeah, I mean, it gets exhausting, right? But at the same time, I think that, now encountering those microaggressions, I think when was the last time that I encountered that? It wasn't long ago. What was it? They don't stay with me as much.
Sure.
I think when I was younger, when I had more anger management issues, they would keep me up at night, right? I can't remember what it was, but just recently where I walked in somewhere and somebody mistook me for, and I can't remember what, they speak for an employee, even though I was there, I think I was there to shop, and somebody mistook for an employee. And you know, before I would get really mad about that, right? Now it's like whatever, just let it wash out because there's other things to be mad about in the world. But if anything, you know, I feel at least I feel a sense of obligation to myself now more than try to establish a kind of superiority or dignity. Like, because that, you know, when you start responding to these microaggressions in front of the people, you really are doing it for yourself. You're doing it for them. They're the ones that benefit from that. Right, because you're like you're proving something to them. You're like, well, why do we need to do that all the time? Right, just let it go. This is not going to matter to them 5 minutes from now, and 4 hours from now, you're still going to be, you know, rolling this thing around your head. So one of the important lessons, as I matured, was to let go of those things and to really engage in the battles that really mattered long term, not just short term, not just showing one person or two people, but rather, you know, a community or communities. Like, that became more important.
I mean, in your defense, I hardly think that's an anger management issue. You know? So that's like such a legitimate issue. As somebody who was born in this country and raised by when my parents came to this country, they came as graduate students in 1972. And I think that my parents and my siblings and I always thought that class would insulate us from everything. And my parents never raised us with any... Culturally, we are so American. None of my siblings can speak Bengali. We all rejected Bengali food, which is crazy because it's the best food in the world. And I know almost nothing about Indian or Bengali culture. Almost nothing. I've never seen a Bengali film. Like, it's kind of crazy. But I know about, like, silver spoons and Who's the Boss. Like, that's my culture. I'm culturally very American. And I don't think it was until I was an adult, until maybe after 9/11, I was 24 when that happened, that I realized how un-American I seem, that I realized that I was not a mind, that I was a body. And I traveled a lot for a period right when I had my first son, and man, I hate traveling in this country now. I hate traveling in this country, and I just came back from California with my kids. We're such a freak show as it is at the airport because my husband is white, we have 2 black children. It's like a whole thing when you leave, you know, Brooklyn. It's a whole thing. And, you know, we're at the airport and my older son said to me, like, Daddy, why do you always have to wait there in security? And I was like, well, I don't know, but you should tell my mother about this experience because my mother thought that we would come here and be upper middle class Americans and we'd be set.
Let me stay with you for a second because I'm thinking about your sons and you write about this a little bit in terms of gender in the great essay where you're thinking about femininity and womanhood and how to train your sons essentially to be feminists. And I wonder how you're going to start laying out for them all the things that they get to inherit culturally. In terms of blackness, in terms of South Asianness, if you will, you know, there's one thing in Brooklyn, but then there's the rest of the...
It is one thing, and I think my husband and I both felt that it was much more important for them to possess the culture that they seem to possess from an outsider's perspective. So we purposefully moved, as I told you, just upstairs that we have to move again, but we moved to this neighborhood because it was full of black people, and now it's full of rich white people, and so we're going to move further into Brooklyn where there are still West Indian people and there are still sort of middle-class black people. We send them to a school where that is a black school. We send them to a school of African arts on the weekends. Like, we're trying very hard to give them something that they can possess that belongs to them. It doesn't belong to me, although of course culture belongs to everybody, but it doesn't belong to me, it doesn't belong to my husband, it belongs to our sons. So that's what we're trying to do.
Besides learning how to deal with cops publicly, and you know, I'm kind of wary about talking about this in public because there's some things that are coded in that you know now. We don't want y'all to know all our secrets. But besides learning how to deal with being a body in public, what were the other processes of belonging that you had to move through before you could start thinking about and talking about home, being New Orleans and then subsequently New York, but also still Jamaica?
Well, one of the things that you learn as an immigrant, at least one of the things that happened to me, was you learn to cherish the status of being an outsider, of being a stranger. The question of strangers now is, one that's fraught, that what do we do with a stranger? How should we think of the stranger? That when I entered this nation, the stranger was a celebrated thing, which is a place that welcomed the strangers, a place that was fascinated with the stranger. I might think the stranger only sell weed and listen to Bob Marley and ride along in a carts trying to enter the Winter Olympics, during the summer, But so just about everybody, is asking, have you seen Cool Runnings? Do you listen to Bob Marley? Do you have any weed? But there is still a sense that the stranger brought something fascinating. That the stranger was a source of joy, a source of discovery, and there's almost that Tocquevillian attitude that you could keep going from place to place in the country and asking people, tell me about the country, tell me about yourself, tell me what St. Louis is like, talk to me about St. Paul, talk to me about Wheaton, Illinois, talk to me about New Mexico. And there's this wonderful thing about being on the outside, of coming with fresh eyes. I mean, the ways in which you walk through Times Square and you're like, why do people find this thing enjoyable? It's like, what is there to like? But you linger long enough and you recognize that there's something about like seeing the city, with these fresh eyes, with the eyes of a tourist, with a tourist point of view, that everything is new, everything is stimulating. The subways are exciting, and people bouncing into you, and the whole crowd is something to be enthralled by. And so, being an immigrant, or when I was a student before I became, I'd gotten permanent residence, there is something about always being in a state of discovery and learn to navigate it. And so even the frustrations, you still felt almost that you're passing through it and become a resident yet. And so there is a joy in saying, yeah, even though this is a little bit problematic, it's their problem. I'm going to go back to Jamaica at some point. And then also, well, my nature is to be mischievous, and so even the mischief would work. So, you go to a place and you realize, okay, the thing that I really should get a discount at CVS and do and read, because just about every time I go in there, some of the things I work there. So I have no clue I'm not getting staff discounts, but you get used to that happening so much that you eventually learn to play with it, as a way to avoid frustration. So you talk about microaggressions. Like when I was in Chicago, I'd go to, I guess they don't expect black people to say heavy metal concerts or rock concerts, and they'd always like, oh, the service entrance are around the back. So I'm like, I'm not going to get offended. I'm going to see a free concert. And so,
Wait, does this actually work?
I eventually got booted after doing it for like 2 months. They're like, hold on. You can't be like the grip for all these bands. So I'd actually just come and I'd walk right through the service entrance, say nothing, and they're like, oh, it's a black guy, of course he works there. And I'd just like the audience said, walk straight on the stage, come down, I'm in the audience. I'm like, all right, cool. And it kept working until I actually went to one of these concerts where they decided to actually have chairs, and so it wasn't general seating. I'm like, oh, I have no tickets. This won't work. As I got booted. But it's like, yeah, so you guys are going to assume that I work here. I'll work here. I see a free concert. And so the way I chose to do it was to sort of cherish the status of being a stranger, cherish the status of being an outsider, and see it as a vehicle to discover, see it as a, in a way to have these encounters. I mean, the way it is that you live in a city and you take so many things for granted that, you can count on one hand how much friends you have if you're a New Yorker who've actually been to the Statue of Liberty, or you can count. You can't count, how much friends you have who will try to do anything to get out of taking visitors to Times Square. And so that way of taking things for granted. So the way I navigated it was to see, all these frustrations as a way of having that tourist point of view, a way of being that outsider that's forever enthralled, forever discovering, that person who was at once cartographer and geologist and geographer who saw the city as layers and was continually peeling away the layers to recognize that everything is irreducibly complex. And if I just keep peeling the layers, I could keep discovering what these things were. But then once you got the green card and you became a resident here, it became harder to navigate because suddenly you recognize, okay, this is my country. I'm sick and tired of being locked out of my own talks, which actually has happened before. I've gone there like, no. I said, I'm the speaker. And I'm always late, so people actually go to really believe that I'm late. They won't think that I'm outside here, and I have to actually call and say, yes, I'm outside. I can't get into my own talk. They don't really believe that I'm the person speaking. Or giving a talk at the Ivy League University where somebody comes up and said, so what? Oh, so Chardonnay for her, anything red for me, and then he hands me all the napkins and the empty cups. I'm like, the receptionist for me, you were in the front row. You just saw me give a 1 hour talk. Also, I was the only black guy in the room of 400. You should be able to figure it out.
You were doubling, though.
Or since we did an NBCC thing, I mean, this happened a couple of years ago at Penn. Penn was sold out, and that happened to me over and over again. Now I look nothing like Tedra Cole, in height and everything like that. But I remember a couple of years ago, everybody kept coming and so like I won the Pulitzer Prize. I won a National Book Award. I won NBCC. Because, Colson wins, and everybody's like, oh, congrats, man. Tedra wins, congrats, man. And so suddenly once you then become attached, this thing of not being seen for who you are and no longer able to sort of have that outsider pose, but being integrated and then becomes more a source of frustration.
When did you, Porochista, begin to stop passing and start playing or performing the Iranian Americanness as a kind of rich and fertile ground, right? Where, one of the things I found really powerful about your most recent novel is that mythology isn't something to put to the side, it's something to bring from another place to enhance how you might see the new space. Is that also part of the process of coming to belong?
Well, it's interesting because I was just like hearing Garnette and Rigo talk about sort of like as you get older, you sort of learn to be less bothered. Or it made me think that you have to be proactive about your happiness as an immigrant more than most Americans, I think, because there's a lot to be down on. And so you have to really find a way to find the joy in it. I realized that most of my, I'm about to turn 40, but most of my youth, I was so angry. I was an activist at single digits. And so I had a lot of anger, and I realized that a lot of my anger came from directing everything towards whiteness. Like I was always angry at white people. I just constantly carried rage around about white people. And then I started to think, I think it wasn't even until, I don't know when it was really, someone at some point said to me, why do you care what they think so much? And that was a really important thing for me to think about, because I realized that I had, as the firstborn child who had, tried to get a scholarship to go to college here and had tried to really make America work, it was important for me to have the approval of white people, and it was also really important for me to be better than white people. I would find myself being incredibly competitive whenever I'd be in a room with white people. Never with other people of color or other Iranians, but I still catch myself sometimes like this. Like I see a white person like flaunting something, I'm like, oh bitch, this is like don't even I'm just gonna be the best at whatever that thing is that I didn't even care about 2 seconds ago. I'm now gonna be the best at that, and you're gonna see. And that was like a survival thing. So even like the second novel you're talking about, there was like a weird mashup of Persian mythology. It was almost like a dare for me to do this super weird book. I had my first publishers were kind of like, this is a career ruiner, you don't want to do this. They basically just wanted my first book, which was more of a traditional immigrant narrative. And I was like, no, I'm going to do that book. I was constantly trying to raise stakes, and so there's always a lot of fighting and struggle with being in America for me. And lately, I've been thinking, especially living in Harlem, where most of my building is Muslim, and we're all Muslim from different backgrounds, and we've just been talking a lot amongst ourselves about how to survive this moment, because everyone's really been depressed, of course, and we've had at least 9 deportations in my building. we've seen the ICE agents constantly. So my dog barks when they come, so we all know when they're there. So it's like we do a lot of coping in the hallways and talking, so there's a lot of humor now. And then there's also this other thing about optimism and being proactive, about joy. There's also this idea that I think some immigrants of color might relate to, is that we actually feel like we're not crazy for once. Like all this shit that we've been saying for years about white people and white supremacy, like you can see it now. Like there's no way to deny it. You look crazy if you deny it. So there is also like a relief in kind of being right and being like, here it is, this racist place. So anyways, yeah.
Yeah, I wonder about that because I forgot who it was, maybe last year, was writing about resiliency and how that word is really tricky because it sets up this premise that you all ought to withstand everything. Like, yeah, okay, now we see it, but you're okay, right? How do you cope? Like, what are the, I mean, if you're trying to go through a process of claiming this place, right? The Times and the Observer and consecutive weekends, but is it easier to go home and walk around than it is to be here?
Ooh, good question. My gosh. For me, let's see. I was 17 when I left Jamaica. Is it easier to walk around in Jamaica? I try. I mean, when I go home, I don't stay with my family at my family's house. I don't stay at my mother's house for obvious reasons. You know, being with my wife, she would rather stay at the hotels. So I'm in New Kingston usually because when we come, my wife is American. She loves Kingston. And so we have to stay in Kingston whenever I'm back home. And to just walk around, mostly Emancipation Park, or, you know, I'd probably call a friend and say, oh, you know, what are you doing? Who's living in Jamaica? And they'll take me up somewhere that they're more familiar with. It's so interesting because most of the times the things that I incorporate while living here in terms of that PDA, I'm not much of a handholder there. Or if I'm with her, I try my hardest, like I'm sitting the same way, like how I'm with Porochista, in terms of not trying hard not to look at her a certain way or hold her hand until we get up to the hills where my friends are taking me, or we get up to a certain place, safe space in Kingston area. Me by myself as an adult Jamaican woman, I don't think so, because I think I got a little shy with the men on the streets, you know, with like, pss, pss, you know, sexy. That to me as well was something that that turned me off. But I actually feel a lot safer walking around in New York City. To me, it's like just walking. But at the same time, the whole, like, being aware now of race, even more so than when I came here in 1999. That really, I'm fighting hard to actually, you know, cope with that. You know, what it means to be on a sidewalk and someone not see me, you know, someone actually walk through me. You know, what is it like to be on a subway sitting down and somebody actually sit on top of you or not say, excuse me, as if like, you're just there. You know, and those are the things that now as an immigrant, I wish more than ever that I came, as Garnette said, with that naivety. You know, it's hard to get back that naivety. And I want it back so desperately. You know, like even going back to Times Square, for example, or the Statue of Liberty. Yes, I take those trips, and still, yes, I try my hardest to think like I would have been thinking in 1999. But then, you know, reality rushes in, and I'm here now. And so, in terms of existing as a Black woman in America, that's really what I'm coping with at this moment in time.
Just kind of rapid fire, so that we can imbibe a little bit. I want to think about or talk about writing about all of this kind of stuff. Let's use the idea of fresh eyes, right? How does one, Rigo, remain the stranger and bring fresh eyes to talking about these kinds of experiences, right? I mean, I think it's a gift and a curse, but maybe more of a gift, right? To continually get certain kinds of assignments or continually imagine characters who are coming out of these experiences to fashion lives for themselves. But what kind of work does the writer have to do to find newness, to find that little edge to bring into play?
You know, one of the things that I had to reconcile, because I write about the Mexican experience mostly, and one of the things that I had to come to terms with is the fact that some of these stories or some of these anxieties that I was dealing with in my writing 15 years ago, I'm still dealing with them. That they have not gone away, that I haven't quite found answers to things like, racist encounters, or things like feeling excluded or invisible, that there are moments where I still feel that, right? But now, but writing about them in my late 40s is for me, certainly is more satisfactory in terms of my own sense of reconciling with this long and difficult journey. And I don't feel like I write this and then I just become depressed. I feel like, these stories need to continually be out there because the next generation that reads them is going to add to them. Mm-hmm. That's what I feel. So I need to write my journey, and that's what I'm going to put out there. But I invite those that are coming right after me to continue some of these discussions and see things in ways that I have not seen, or that I'm limited, even after 20 or 30 years of writing about them.
Well, first, before I go on, I just want to say that 2 years ago I was at the Brooklyn Book Festival with a friend of mine who's also a writer, who is white, and we were sitting in the audience, and somebody from the festival came up to me and was speaking to me, and it was very clear after a minute that he was under the impression that I was Junot Diaz. And so I find hearing these stories very satisfying, and my friend who was white was absolutely aghast. And I was like, and I think it's sort of like you were saying, you can't actually hold on to that so closely because you have other things you have to do. And, and I love that story because now it's my story. It's my story. It's not Junot Diaz's story. It's not that guy's story. It's my story. So, and my parents raised us as such Americans, and what they made me, in a sense, is this incredible invisible spy. And I think that's very, very useful when you work as an artist. And so if invisibility is inflicted upon all of us in different ways, in some ways, I think that's very useful in this line of work.
I'm of the opinion that we do really need to do something new. I think America is having a huge immigrant moment, not because of all these anti-immigrant laws, but I think a bunch of us just woke up to a foreign country. So there are so many Americans now are now experiencing what we've been experiencing for a long time, to the point that, so what has actually happened is this great loss of innocence, which is something that the immigrant is forever talking about, writing about, dealing with, this loss of innocence. And I think for so many people in America, it's that loss of innocence. And so I don't think we have to write something new as much as, I think one of the most powerful things about immigrants writing is something that I've been obsessed with, the idea of the blind spot. What is there right in front of you that's right in your purview that you're not seeing, and it is so easy to see if you just make a slight shift? And so I think we don't have to write something new so much as to continually write about our experiences, because we're continually pushing against this idea of invisibility. And as immigrants, we're either given the option of hypervisibility in a way that's dangerous, or invisibility in a way that's pernicious. And so we don't have to write something new as much as to recognize that, well, everybody's having their immigrant moment. They're all waking up to a foreign country. Let me talk to you about this foreign country. This is what the country is like. This is what it is. And so this loss of innocence, which reminds me of that early part in Ball in the Fire Next Time, when he's saying, oh, but it's an bitter, all these things I'm talking about. He's writing to his nephew, and he goes, well, talk to your grandmother. Nobody would accuse of her being bitter. And she's there and she can tell you, and they know where to find her. She's been there this whole time in front of them, but she's been invisible to them. Mm-hmm. So I think it's the same thing for all of us, and as an immigrant writer, I'm not going to do anything new. I just going to keep writing about these experiences and know that people are waking up more and more to a foreign country and will ask or explain us of this foreign country. And we're like, oh, well, here's Porochista. Mm-hmm. Here's Nicole, telling you about this foreign country and helping you with your blind spot. letting you know what was right in front of your purview, and it just shifting the perspective for you a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I would say as a writer, but also as a critic, I'm not so worried about what we're putting out. I'm really not worried about the content. I was just telling someone recently that I think the best work I've ever read in my life, and I've been a reader my whole life, it's been coming out now. I think writers are putting out incredible work. But we do have to address the industry. And it's unfortunate that we as writers and artists have to be also spokesmen we have to be active within our community. And we're in a deeply racist community. The literary world and publishing is truly and incredibly racist. There's no other way to say it. I've been in different industries. I've never seen anything like it. I think all sorts of other industries in the arts can speak to this, even tech, even Wall Street and finance. I mean, maybe their fear of money and lawsuits makes them more scared. There's less at stake here. But we sort of have to be activists, and we have to be very bold and speak up within our communities, because the only reason you know who we are is because we were picked. You know, somebody said that we mattered, our stories mattered enough. And then there was a bunch of other things that happened that made us matter, or we had to push, you know. But we have to constantly fight this incredibly, shamefully racist sort of setup that we're in, and we can't get too comfortable. So that's a fight that I think is ongoing. It's not the work the writers are putting out at all, I don't think.
And I think it's more than skin, it's more than race,
Yeah.
because one of the things that I find myself fighting with, first of all, I have a great agent, I have a great editor who gets dialect, when my characters are speaking to each other as Jamaican people. But I had a very interesting moment in the New York Times twice with two of my essays. Where there's a rule against that, because if I'm writing about Jamaicans, I can't write. I have to write standard English, them speaking to each other in standard English. And the very, very nice editor said at the New York Times that said to me, "Wow, this is a very old rule, and I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. It's not up to me. It's." And so I had to fight for dialect, for an ounce of dialect in the New York Times. And I said to myself, wow, here I am, I was let into this country, an immigrant, a black woman. And yes, under the guise, yes, we're accepted, we're handpicked, somehow, and knocking hard with that. But, I'm lucky, we're lucky here to be here sitting in front of you speaking, right? We all have a voice up here. But at the same time, there are different levels of fights you have to put up with for you as an entire being to be accepted. And for me, it's language, right? And which is ironic because, like James Baldwin says, language is the biggest part of our identity. So to deny that identity, to deny that part of a person, is also eliminating or pushing away them as a whole. And so for me having to fight for my language, to be in my writing, to be in my essays, in the New York Times, it's something that I was somehow awakened. I think I was definitely venting to my wife, and this is actually the first time I'm saying it out loud, where I'm like, wow, this is interesting. And so I know that we're not done fighting yet. It has just begun. So
Let's thank the panel. And if any of you have questions, let's take about 2 or 3 questions before we go to the wine.
The most interesting thing, like subtext of like the DACA immigration thing, is I've seen no white immigrants.
Volume. I think people at the back can't hear you.
Oh,
Here.
okay. Sorry. Can everybody hear me? All right. In the back too? Okay. The interesting thing, I'm like listening to this panel and I'm thinking about everything I've seen in the response to DACA. I've seen no like European immigrants feel threatened by the idea that their immigration status is at stake. That everybody that's come to talk about it have been immigrants of color. And I think that's a very interesting thing. And it's not to say that European immigrants are not threatened, but it's like the idea of what you say, Cardigan, my bad, Garnette. The idea of like walking into spaces and feeling unthreatened in certain ways, and the idea that like there are many white immigrants who don't see this as their problem as well, and they see that as that's like y'all problem, but not an immigrant problem. So I think that like the subtext of the word immigrant is like bodies of color, and I think that that's been like very found, like just to me it's become more pronounced as I'm hearing everyone's experiences, and I'm like I haven't seen like anyone like white from a European nation talk about how their status has shifted, and I wanted to know if that's been something y'all have seen as well, and y'all talking about it.
I think that it's just a euphemism when we say immigrant, really. I mean, that's why you have South Asian people who are like of Hindu background or Sikh background getting like assaulted and by people saying they're Iranian.
Yeah.
You know, they're not really worried if they're Muslim or not, really. Like, the whole Muslim thing is kind of a joke. It's really just a fear of, like, brown men that could be terrorists. So, I think these are all euphemisms. If we really get down to it, it's just pure racism. That's really the heart of it.
I've known a few Europeans, but it's because I'm always wandering the street, who feel threatened. And I know, for instance, a lot of artist visas have been turned down. There was somebody who was an activist, like that's been the right word for her, in the London embassy, who just got fired, who was just turning down visas one after the other. If you're an artist, if you're coming with less than $4 million in your pocket, she didn't want you here, irrespective of the race. So it's been all over the board. But then again, it feels that the real brunt of who's really getting crushed on the heel more than anything else are people of color. And for some people, as you're saying, immigrants is a euphemism. There's once a question of like the way there's a kind of paroxysm that is happening, that people already had different biases or resentments that they now feel a license, to, follow through with it, with a velocity, with a zeal that they hadn't before. And so sometimes immigrant is just a foil for, I don't really like blacks and Hispanics, or God, those Middle Easterners again, or anytime somebody starts, pronounce it like the first letter, like the alphabet, like Arab, you're like, oh, I'm in trouble. Somebody like, oh, those Arabs, I'm like, uh-oh, here we go. He said Arab, that's almost like a signal. It's not like the signal like, I'm not racist, but, you go, uh-oh, here it comes. And so, yes, I'm seeing it across the board, but ferocity, reserved, especially for people of color.
And can I also address like an elephant in the room as well? Because one thing is that here we are as immigrants, but then, I'm married to an African-American woman, and African-Americans are treated like immigrants in their own country, historically, and to this day. And one of the things that infuriates me now is that, wow, yes, I'm here as a Jamaican woman, I have an accent. And the thing that, I found interesting is that when you have an accent, I'm suddenly more interesting than an African-American woman walking on the street or writing a story. What is that? And so that's something too, if we're going to tackle this concept of stranger in this country, I think we also need to also incorporate the dialogues of African-Americans as well.
Or we're getting back to the panels because we're the safe blacks. Yes, so let's invite the Jamaicans, so we have to invite African American, and we can say, oh, we have, some of the black
Right.
there.
That makes me think of something my father told me probably about 12, 13 when I was starting to wander, on my own around Terre Haute, Indiana. And he said, listen, you have to negotiate a couple things here. One, you're African American by birth, but you have wiggle room because your last name is Muyumba, so you're not going to be received the same way. So what that doesn't mean that you get off. That what that means is you have to actually own the thing you've inherited by birth and advocate and resist and fight from that position. Your question also makes me think of something that Rachel Gonza spoke about in relationship to her recent piece about Dylan Roof and GQ. It just dawned on her, talk about, fresh eyes. she took Fresh Eyes to South Carolina, and it dawned on her that it's always people of color, especially black people in this country, who do the DNA test and say, oh my God, I'm like 8% Irish. I didn't like that. But very rarely do you hear white Americans pause and go, snap, I'm Nigerian? Oh.
I know we're repping.
If there is Nigerian there, it's like, you get the Kleenex. Because they're going to start crying about that.
I encourage anybody who visits New Orleans to go to the New Orleans Public Library in the rare books collection, like in the archive floor. Just there and spend a week if you have a week. And over again, you will always see some old lady, white lady crying because of the genealogy and go, oh no, there's black in my family. Ah! I mean, I've seen it like multiple times. And I said, what happened? And the librarian is like, black again.
Hi, thank you for the panel. So my question is, I think that's something that a lot of writers that come from, like, I mean, if they're writers of color, but also if they're from any marginalized community, they end up having to always write about the bad thing, or like you're like always commissioned to, you know, speak as a X, or like to explain, you know, to help people process the thing, or, you know, whatever it is. And I was wondering how you guys kind of deal with that cycle, and I guess what are your thoughts about breaking it? Like, I mean, if it's possible.
Well, I just want to say that for me, as long as I'm doing everything, as long as I'm doing both addressing issues that are important to me and to my community, and as long as editors like will also see me as somebody capable of reviewing a white author. You know, I write for the Center School Chronicle, the LA Times, and it's great when I don't always get a Latino author, because then they understand that I'm literate, that I can actually read, right? And that's what, and it's interesting because that's what books are supposed to be. Books are for anybody who will come to them, right? Even though they may have been written with a certain kind of audience, but you want the book's audience to be very expansive, right? But then when it comes to criticism or critics, they're like, oh, well, you know, here's Sandra Cisneros, you know, why don't you write a review? I mean, that's great, you know, I can do that too, but then, you know, I can also do Arundhati Roy, I can also do, you know, anyway.
Actually, let's pause there and start imbibing wine. You can address any other questions you might have after they get their first glasses. They'll be looser lipped then. Let's thank the panel one more time.